Today I'm baking fruit mince pies, a Christmas treat that we have been making in my family ever since I was a little girl. I start by grinding cloves and chopping half the sultanas. As most of you know, I live in Tuscany, and as I was walking through Florence yesterday, watching Italians buy from the pasticceria, the supermercato alimentari, I realized that these days the tradition for most Italians at Christmas is to buy their baked goods. Of course, there are still some families in the countryside who make fried dolci like cartellate, struffoli, and other things, but most Italians buy the classics like panforte, torrone, panettone, and pandoro. Like many Italian Christmas baked goods, fruit mince pies have a filling of dried fruit, nuts, and spices. I usually make this filling with a mix of currants, raisins, and sultanas, but I could only find sultanas here in Florence, so that's all I'm using. You want to get a nice medium-sized pot. You can just leave the filling to macerate, which means that the sultanas soak in all the flavors overnight, and it's much more flavorful. But if you can't wait, I sometimes just heat the ingredients to expedite that process. Add some dark sugar. You can add more or less of these ingredients for the filling, depending on your preference. And we need a whole apple. Do you want to hear a little story about this dress I'm wearing? I bought it 12 years ago in an antique market in Bologna. I was there with my parents and I had to try it on in the middle of the street. There was no mirror, and I was looking for something for a very glamorous party that I'd been invited to by the historic jewelry brand Bulgari in Castel Sant'Angelo in Rome. We were traveling down from Bologna, and I remember being in a tiny village of Tarquinia, rushing around trying to find someone who could dry clean a silk vintage dress. Anyway, I arrived in Rome the evening of the event, and I was so nervous about whether I'd chosen the right outfit. I saw all these other women in short skirts and low-cut necklines and backless dresses, and I walked onto the red carpet that ran the length of the bridge across to the castle where the party was being held. And the paparazzi were flashing their cameras at all the famous faces, and then suddenly they started getting really excited when Alain Delon walked onto the red carpet. Now, Alain Delon is a French actor, but he is adored in Italy because during the golden era of cinema in the 60s, he starred in some of Italy's most classic films, Gattopardo, L'Eclisse, Rocco e i suoi fratelli. He even made Purple Noon, the original film that inspired the talented Mr. Ripley. Anyway, we were on the red carpet, the photographers were calling out his name, and he turned away from them, walked over to me, looked me straight in the eye, smiled and said, "Bellissima." And then he walked away. Now, of course, he was very old by then, so perhaps it's not much of a compliment, but you have to understand, for a girl who studied Italian cinema and who was so nervous about my dress, this was still quite a moment for me, because it let me play with the fantasy that it was 1969 instead of 2009, the era for which this silk red dress was intended. And since then, I've always had a spectacular night every time I wear this dress. Have you ever had an item of clothing like that where you put it on and just magic things happen? By the way, just to finally dice the apple. So now in the pot I have sultanas, brown sugar, and diced apple, and I just want a little juice and all the zest of this beautiful orange. I always think about how once upon a time oranges were such a precious gift at Christmas time that children would be thrilled to find in their stocking. The Chinese and other ancient cultures believe oranges bring good luck and ward off evil. And in fact, they look so vibrant and hopeful on a cold winter's day. You can imagine how exciting to find one in your stocking. But perhaps children of today wouldn't be so thrilled, I don't know. Just grate in the zest. And squeeze a bit of the juice. Now I'm also adding some candied orange, which Italians use in a lot of desserts at this time of year, and we want it finely chopped. And now some fresh ginger. Guido and my parents and my sister all love ginger, so I like to add quite a lot. It gives the flavour a gentle heat. I want to grate this in so I can't measure it, and I tried weighing it to give you an exact size, but it was too light. So just see in the palm of my hand for scale. Honestly though, you could add as little or as much as you prefer. Now some pinoli, or pine nuts. We went walking through this pine tree forest the other day and found fresh pine nuts in the pine cones. Some cinnamon, some nutmeg, and the cloves I ground earlier. And some butter. If you're adding alcohol and you want a subtle flavour, add it halfway through the heating. If you want a stronger flavour, you might want to add it after it's off the heat. And now I put this all on a gentle heat to infuse the fruit with all those spices. I am using Vinsanto, which is a Tuscan dessert wine. I actually make this recipe from memory rather than a recipe, and change it slightly depending on how many people I'm serving. At this point of cooking, I decided I wanted to make about 17 or 18 pies instead of 12, because I'm taking these down for my family and then leaving some for Guido's mother. So I added another chopped apple and another half cup of sultanas. And after only a little time, it will be fragrant and sticky with the caramelized apples, and your kitchen will smell of Christmas. As I said, this filling gets better and better with time, so you really should try making it a day or so in advance. It would be delicious just served with ice cream. Now we can prepare the pastry. Again, I make this from memory because pastry results really change depending on the climate and the flour and the quality of the butter. When I'm making this in Australia in tropical heat, the quantities change a little. So it's a good idea to mix the cold butter in with your hands so that you learn when pastry feels right. Also, if butter and flour are overmixed, it can ruin the texture of your pies. So this is another reason I think I never have problems with pastry, is I don't use a mixer. I always flavour my pastry with citrus, either the zest of a lemon or an orange, a little sugar, and the butter must be cold straight from the fridge. Dicing it makes it easier to incorporate by hand. At this point, I remembered that I was making 17 instead of 12, so I added a bit more flour. The butter should be roughly combined with the flour and sugar. Now I add 2 egg yolks. And add iced water, a half teaspoon at a time, so that you can monitor things and make sure it's only as much as is needed so your dough isn't too sticky. So after bringing it together with your fingertips, if it's not feeling right, just add a little more water. But remember that you will need to form the ball of the dough, so you may think it's too dry, but just keep sort of working it with your hands, and as your body heat warms the butter, the dough will come together, so don't go pouring in too much water. Just be patient. and this gets covered and put in the fridge to rest for half an hour or even an hour. Now my pastry dough is ready, and I like to divide it into 1/3 for the tops and 2/3 for the bottoms of the pies. You can smell the orange. Just cover the piece you're not using. You should be able to roll this out without it sticking to the rolling pin. However, if you tend to have troubles with pastry, make your life easier by putting it between 2 sheets of baking paper. The recipe will be on my site carlyflavel.com, but truly the best way to become a good home cook is to learn to trust your instincts and go by eye and touch. I like to cut little circles for the base, little circles of baking paper that is. Some people bake fruit mince pies in those tins with round bottoms, but I'm just using a muffin pan. I want sharp corners and I want to avoid the pastry being too thick around those corners, so I'm only putting baking paper on the bottom, not on the sides. These won't stick to the sides, but having the baking paper underneath just helps a little in case you have trouble getting them out. I prick each base with a fork so they don't puff up. And now I roll out the dough for the tops. By now the butter will have melted a little, so you may want to roll over the baking paper to avoid it sticking to the rolling pin.
Angels we have heard on high, sweetly singing o'er the plains, and the mountains in reply, echoing their joyous strains.
If you want, you can whisk a little egg and just sort of brush that over with a pastry brush or your fingertips.
What the gladsome tidings be, which inspire your heavenly song.
All pastry is fragile while warm, so be sure to leave the pies to cool and then attempt taking them out, otherwise they could just fall apart. The best method I've found is to run a knife gently around the outside and then lift under one side and they should just pop out. I like the pastry to be quite delicate and thin because it makes them light and balanced with the filling, but if you don't feel so confident with pastry, then you could make these much thicker so they're less fragile, and I guess then you would be making about 12 instead of 17.
Come to Bethlehem and see Christ whose birth the angels sing. Come adore on bended knee Christ the Lord, the newborn King. Gloria in excelsis Deo. Gloria in excelsis Deo.
Thank you for watching. Thank you to my patrons. Are you in the Christmas spirit? Perhaps you might like last year's episode on homemade vintage Christmas baubles, or an Italian Christmas recipe for ricciarelli, homemade Italian chocolate truffles, and a gluten-free, sugar-free version, and an elegant homemade chocolate box. Or perhaps you'd like to see Guido and I decorating a Christmas tree, my wreath made entirely from the woods around the house, and my recipe for the perfect gingerbread men. If you've seen all these, well, thank you so much. You'll just have to wait for more Christmas episodes next Friday. Buon Natale, alla prossima.